The sun was setting over Pine Ridge, casting long shadows across Main Street. The small town had always prided itself on being a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other, but times were changing. New families were moving in, bringing with them fresh perspectives and challenging old ways of thinking. Officer Richard Thompson sat in his patrol car, finishing the last bites of his sandwich. He'd been with the Pine Ridge Police Department for 15 years, and had seen the town transform from a sleepy rural area to a growing suburb. Some days, he barely recognized the place he'd grown up in. Richard was nearing the end of his shift when the call came through. A report of teenagers causing trouble at Wilson Park. He sighed, crumpled his sandwich wrapper, and started the engine. These calls were becoming more frequent lately, and he was tired of playing babysitter to bored kids with nothing better to do. When Richard arrived at the park, he saw a group of teenagers hanging around the basketball court. Most of them were shooting hoops, but a few were sitting on the bleachers, music blasting from a portable speaker. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but Richard had received a call, so he needed to check it out. He parked his cruiser and approached the group. Most of the kids noticed him and tensed up immediately. Richard had seen that reaction countless times before, the sudden stiffening, the wary eyes, the whispered warnings to friends. He'd become so used to it that he barely registered it anymore. "Evening, folks," Richard called out, scanning the group. "Got a complaint about noise. Mind turning that down a bit?" One of the boys, around 16 or 17, stood near the speaker. He wore a red basketball jersey and had been in the middle of a conversation when Richard approached. The boy glanced at the officer, then reached over and lowered the volume slightly. "Like that?" the boy asked, his tone just barely on the right side of respectful. Richard nodded, but something about the kid's attitude rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the long day, or the accumulated stress of the past few weeks, but Richard felt his patience wearing thin. "ID, please," Richard said, taking a step closer. The boy's eyebrows shot up. "For what?" "I turned down the music." "ID," Richard repeated, his voice hardening. "Now." The other teenagers had stopped playing by now. They gathered around, watching the exchange with nervous expressions. One of them, a shorter boy with glasses, tugged at the first boy's arm. "Just show him, Michael," the boy with glasses whispered. Michael hesitated, then reached into his pocket for his wallet. As he did, Richard noticed a car pulling into the parking lot. A dark SUV with tinted windows. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in a suit stepped out. "I don't even know why you need my ID," Michael said, still searching for his wallet. "We weren't doing anything wrong." "That's not for you to decide," Richard snapped, his patience finally giving way. The approaching figure of the man from the SUV registered in his peripheral vision, but Richard kept his focus on the boy. "Let me see some identification now, or we're going to have a problem." Michael pulled out his wallet and fumbled with it. A card slipped from his fingers and fell to the ground. When he bent to pick it up, Richard grabbed him by the arm, yanking him upright. "Hey!" Michael protested, trying to pull away. What happened next occurred in a blur. Michael's sudden movement, the surrounding teenagers' voices rising in alarm, Richard's frayed nerves, it all culminated in a split-second decision that would change everything. Richard's fist connected with Michael's jaw, sending the boy stumbling backward. The park went silent. Michael touched his face, eyes wide with shock and pain. The other teenagers froze, torn between helping their friend and protecting themselves. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice boomed across the park like thunder. Richard turned to see the man from the SUV striding toward them, his face a mask of fury. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with closely cropped gray hair and the confident bearing of someone used to being in charge. "Sir, please stay back," Richard warned, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. "This is police business." "Police business," the man repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. Assaulting a minor is police business in Pine Ridge? Richard's stomach tightened. The man wasn't backing down, and there was something about him, something familiar. "Dad, it's okay," Michael said, his voice strained. He was still holding his jaw, a bruise already forming. "I'm fine. Dad." The word hit Richard like a bucket of ice water. He looked from Michael to the man, suddenly realizing why the man seemed familiar. He'd seen him in the local newspaper just last week. "You're..." Richard began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "Deputy Chief David Walker," the man said, his voice cold. "Starting Monday, I'm your new boss. And you just punched my son." The world seemed to tilt beneath Richard's feet. Deputy Chief Walker had been hired from a larger department in the city, part of an initiative to bring fresh leadership to Pine Ridge. Richard had heard rumors about the new deputy chief's family moving to town ahead of him, but he hadn't connected the dots until this moment. "Sir, I didn't know," Richard started. "That's precisely the problem, isn't it?" Walker cut him off. "You didn't know. You didn't care to know. All you saw was a black teenager you decided was causing trouble. The other teenagers were watching the exchange with wide eyes. Some had their phones out, recording everything." Richard felt sweat breaking out across his forehead. "I received a noise complaint," Richard said weakly. "And that justified assaulting my son?" Walker asked. He turned to Michael. "Are you okay?" Michael nodded, though his eyes were watery. "I'm fine, Dad." Walker turned back to Richard. "Officer, I want your badge number and name. Right now." Richard's mouth went dry. 15 years on the force, and it had come to this. One bad decision, one moment of lost control, and now his career hung in the balance. And worse, he knew in his heart that Walker was right. Would he have reacted the same way if Michael had been white? The question burned in his mind as he recited his information to Walker. The sun had fully set now, the park lit only by streetlights. In their harsh glow, Richard could see the disappointment and anger in Walker's eyes, not just as a police official, but as a father whose son had been harmed right in front of him. "Report to the chief's office first thing tomorrow morning," Walker said. "We'll discuss this incident in detail." He turned to the group of teenagers. "The rest of you, it's getting late. Time to head home." As the teenagers dispersed and Walker led his son back to their SUV, Richard stood alone in the park, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Tomorrow would bring consequences, but the real reckoning was already happening inside him. Something had to change, in the department, in the town, and most importantly, in himself. What Richard didn't know was that this incident would be just the beginning of a transformation that would shake Pine Ridge to its core. Richard barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the look on Michael's face after his fist connected, shock, pain, and something worse, resignation, as if the boy had always expected this to happen someday. And then there was Deputy Chief Walker's expression, not just anger, but profound disappointment that cut Richard deeper than any shouting could have. By 7 a.m., Richard was already sitting in his car outside the Pine Ridge Police Department. His meeting with Chief Roberts wasn't until 9, but he couldn't stay at home with his thoughts any longer. The station was quiet this early, with just the night shift wrapping up and the morning crew starting to trickle in. A few officers nodded at Richard as he entered, but most avoided eye contact. Word traveled fast in a small department like theirs. By now, everyone had probably seen the video. "Morning, Richard." The voice belonged to Officer Jenny Chen, one of the few cops who had joined the force after Richard. She set a cup of coffee on his desk. "Rough night?" Richard nodded, grateful for the small kindness. "You heard?" "Everyone's heard," Jenny said quietly. "That video's already got thousands of views online." Richard's stomach dropped. "Video?" Jenny winced. "You didn't know?" One of the kids posted it. It's all over Facebook and Twitter. Before Richard could respond, the door to Chief Roberts' office opened. Chief Roberts was a stocky man in his early 60s, with a weathered face and gray hair cut military short. His expression was unreadable as he beckoned to Richard. "Thompson. In here." Richard entered the office to find Deputy Chief Walker already seated. Unlike yesterday, Walker was in uniform now, the 4 stars on his collar gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His face was as impassive as the chief's. "Sit down," Chief Roberts said, gesturing to the empty chair. Richard sat, his mouth dry. Through the window behind the chief's desk, he could see Pine Ridge waking up, shop owners unlocking their doors, parents walking children to school. Normal life continuing while his hung in the balance. "I've seen the video," Chief Roberts began. "And I've heard Deputy Chief Walker's account of what happened. Now I want to hear yours." Richard took a deep breath. He could try to justify what happened, the stress of the job, the perceived attitude from Michael, the sudden movement that startled him. But as he opened his mouth, he found he couldn't speak those excuses aloud. "I lost control," he said simply. "There's no excuse for what I did." A flicker of surprise crossed Walker's face, so brief Richard almost missed it. "No," Walker agreed. "There isn't." Chief Roberts leaned forward, hands clasped on his desk. "Richard, you've been with this department for 15 years. Never a complaint, always by the book. What happened out there?" Richard stared at his hands. How could he explain something he was only beginning to understand himself? "I don't know, Chief. I just reacted." "You reacted to a black teenager the way you wouldn't have reacted to a white one," Walker said, his voice level but firm. "Let's not dance around it." Richard flinched but didn't deny it. "I want to say you're wrong, but I can't be sure. And that scares me." The office fell silent. Outside, a siren wailed briefly, then faded. "Michael's not pressing charges," Walker said finally. "He says he just wants to move on." Richard looked up, surprised. "He's not?" Walker shook his head. "My son is a better person than either of us right now. But that doesn't mean there won't be consequences." Chief Roberts nodded. "Effective immediately, you're on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. Badge and gun, please." Even though Richard had expected this, the request hit him hard. 15 years on the force, and now, what? He reached for his badge, running his thumb over the metal one last time before placing it on the desk. His service weapon followed. "There's something else," Walker said. "The mayor's called a town meeting for tomorrow night. The videos caused quite a stir in Pine Ridge. People want answers." "What kind of answers?" Richard asked, though he already knew. "The kind that might be uncomfortable for this department," Walker replied. "The black community in Pine Ridge has been talking about police bias for years. Now they have proof on video." Chief Roberts sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. This couldn't have come at a worse time. Deputy Chief Walker was brought in specifically to help us improve community relations. "And now my own son gets assaulted by one of your officers," Walker said. "Not exactly the fresh start we were hoping for." Richard felt the full weight of what he'd done, not just to Michael, not just to his own career, but to the entire department and community. "What can I do?" he asked. Walker raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me? The father of the boy you hit?" "Yes," Richard said. "I am." Walker studied him for a long moment. "Show up at the town meeting. Answer questions honestly. Don't hide behind the thin blue line. That would be a start." Chief Roberts looked uncomfortable. "Deputy, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Legal might advise against." "With all due respect, Chief," Walker interrupted, this isn't just a legal issue. It's a community one. And communities heal through honesty, not lawyers. Richard nodded slowly. I'll be there. After a few more minutes discussing logistics, Richard was dismissed. As he walked through the station toward the exit, he felt the eyes of his colleagues following him. Some sympathetic, others judging, most just confused. The same Richard Thompson who trained many of them was now walking out without his badge. The world had turned upside down in less than 24 hours. In the parking lot, Richard paused by his car, unsure where to go. Home felt too confining, but he had nowhere else to be. Just as he was about to get in, he heard footsteps behind him. Officer Thompson. Richard turned to see Michael standing a few feet away. The bruise on his jaw had darkened overnight, a vivid purple against his brown skin. Richard's stomach twisted with shame. Michael, Richard said, his voice hoarse. I don't know what to say except I'm sorry. Michael studied him, hands in his pockets. My dad said you're on leave. Richard nodded. It's what I deserve. Maybe, Michael said. But I didn't come here to see you punished. I came to ask you something. What's that? Michael took a deep breath. The town meeting tomorrow, everyone's going to be angry, taking sides. It could make things worse. He paused. Unless we show them something different. Richard frowned. What do you mean? I don't know yet, Michael admitted. But I think we have a chance to turn this into something good. If you're willing to try. As the morning sun rose higher over Pine Ridge, Richard looked at the teenager standing before him, showing more wisdom and grace than Richard had managed in 15 years of policing, and realized this might be the most important conversation of his life. The community center was packed wall to wall by the time Richard arrived. He slipped in through the side door, trying to avoid notice, but heads turned anyway. Conversations hushed as people recognized him from the video. Richard found a spot in the back corner and tried to make himself invisible. The mayor stood at the podium, flanked by Chief Roberts and Deputy Chief Walker. Town officials lined the front row, their faces grim. Thank you all for coming tonight, Mayor Wilson began. As you know, an incident occurred 2 days ago at Wilson Park involving Officer Richard Thompson and a young member of our community. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Richard spotted familiar faces, parents of kids he'd coached in Little League, neighbors he'd waved to for years, shop owners who'd always greeted him with a smile. Now they looked at him with confusion, disappointment, anger. Before we open the floor for questions, the mayor continued, Deputy Chief Walker has asked to speak. Walker approached the microphone, his uniform crisp, his expression solemn. The room fell silent. Many of you know I moved here to help improve relations between the police department and the community, Walker began. What you may not know is that the young man in the video is my son, Michael. Gasps and whispers filled the room. Those who hadn't made the connection looked at Walker with new understanding. As a police officer, I'm committed to justice. As a father, I'm devastated, Walker said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. But tonight isn't about my family. It's about our community. Richard watched as Walker gripped the edges of the podium. For years, many of you have said you don't feel protected by those sworn to protect you. You've been told your experiences weren't real, that the system works for everyone equally. This video has shown that's not true. The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. But pointing fingers won't heal Pine Ridge, Walker continued. We need to rebuild trust, and that starts with accountability. At that moment, the side door opened again. Michael walked in, followed by a group of the teenagers who had been at the park that day. They moved to stand against the wall, not far from Richard. Michael caught Richard's eye and gave a small nod. Then, to Richard's surprise, the boy raised his hand. Yes, Michael? Mayor Wilson said, recognizing him. I'd like to speak, if that's okay, Michael said, his voice cleared despite the bruise still visible on his face. Walker looked startled but nodded his permission. As Michael made his way to the front of the room, Richard felt a mix of dread and hope. What was the boy going to say? The room held its breath as Michael took his place at the microphone, looking out at the divided faces of his new hometown. It was time for Pine Ridge to hear from the person at the center of the storm. Michael adjusted the microphone, looking smaller than his 16 years under the harsh fluorescent lights. The bruise on his jaw was impossible to miss, a visible reminder of what had brought them all together. "My name is Michael Walker," he began, his voice steadied despite the room full of strangers. 2 days ago, I was punched by Officer Thompson at Wilson Park. The bluntness of his words sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Richard felt his face burn with shame. "I could stand here and tell you how wrong it was," Michael continued. "How scared I felt. How it reminded me of warnings my parents gave me about being careful around police. And all of that would be true." He paused, looking around the room. "But that's not why I wanted to speak tonight." The crowd grew quiet again, tension hanging in the air. "Since it happened, I've been thinking about what this means, not just for me, but for Pine Ridge. This town is supposed to be my family's new home. It's supposed to be a place where everyone belongs." Michael's gaze found Richard in the corner. "Officer Thompson made a mistake. A serious one. And he should face consequences for it." Richard nodded slightly, accepting the judgment. "But I don't want his mistake to divide this town even more," Michael said, surprising everyone. "I don't want people choosing sides between the police and the community. We can't afford that." Deputy Chief Walker watched his son with a mixture of pride and concern. "Yesterday, Officer Thompson came to our house," Michael revealed. "He apologized to me and my family face to face. No excuses. No lawyers. Just a man admitting he was wrong and asking how he could make it right." This was news to most people in the room. Richard remembered the hardest conversation of his life, sitting in the Walkers' living room, feeling like an intruder in their new home. "I told him the only way to make it right is to make sure it never happens again, not to me, not to anyone else in Pine Ridge," Michael said. "And he agreed." Michael turned to look directly at his father and Chief Roberts. "So I have a proposal. Instead of firing Officer Thompson, make him part of the solution." The suggestion sparked immediate reactions, some nodding thoughtfully, others shaking their heads in disagreement. "My dad was brought here to build bridges between the police and the community," Michael explained. "Well, now there's a broken bridge that needs fixing. And Officer Thompson should help rebuild it." He took a deep breath. "I'm willing to work with him, to share my perspective as a black teenager and listen to his as a police officer. If we can learn from each other, maybe others can too." The room fell silent as people processed Michael's words. It wasn't the angry denunciation many had expected. Instead, it was an invitation to something more difficult, and more hopeful. "That's all I wanted to say," Michael concluded. "Thank you." As he stepped away from the microphone, the silence broke. The community center erupted in a mixture of applause, confused murmurs, and heated discussions. In the midst of the noise, Michael's eyes found Richard's once more, and the message was clear: the ball was now in his court. Richard stood frozen in his corner as the crowd's reactions swirled around him. Michael's words had caught him completely off guard. When he'd apologized to the Walker family, he'd expected nothing in return, certainly not this public gesture of reconciliation. Mayor Wilson returned to the microphone, trying to restore order. "Let's take a 15-minute break," she announced. "When we return, we'll open the floor for questions." As people began filing out for refreshments, Richard noticed Deputy Chief Walker making his way toward him. The crowd parted to let him through, all eyes following the encounter. "He didn't tell me he was going to do that," Walker said quietly when he reached Richard. I wouldn't have expected him to, Richard replied. Your son is remarkable. Walker nodded, a father's pride briefly softening his professional demeanor. He's always been that way. Sees things differently than most people. He paused. So, what do you think of his proposal? Richard took a deep breath. Honestly? It scares me. Facing this community every day, knowing what I did, it would be easier to transfer to another department, start fresh where nobody knows me. Easier, yes, Walker agreed. But right? Before Richard could answer, Chief Roberts joined them, his expression guarded. Walker, Thompson. Let's talk in private. The three men moved to a small office off the main hall. As soon as the door closed, Chief Roberts turned to Richard. This could work to everyone's advantage, he said bluntly. The department avoids a PR nightmare, you keep your job, and we show the community we're taking concrete steps toward reform. Richard frowned. Is that all this is to you? A PR move? Chief Roberts' face reddened. Don't get righteous with me, Thompson. You're the one who put us in this mess. Gentlemen, Walker interrupted. This isn't about department politics. It's about a 16-year-old boy who's brave enough to turn his pain into progress. He looked at Richard. The question is whether you're brave enough to join him. Richard thought about Michael standing at that microphone, offering a hand when he had every right to make a fist. If we do this, he said slowly, it has to be real. Not just for show. Walker nodded. That's the only way it works. The community might not accept it, Chief Roberts warned. They might want you gone, Thompson. Then I'll have to convince them otherwise, Richard said, making his decision. Through actions, not words. When they returned to the main hall, people were filing back in from the break. Richard no longer sought the shadows. Instead, he walked straight to the front of the room and turned to face the community. I'd like to respond to Michael's proposal, he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. Mayor Wilson hesitated, then gestured to the microphone. Officer Thompson has the floor. As Richard approached the podium, he caught sight of Michael watching intently from the side. The teenager gave him a small nod of encouragement. Richard took a deep breath and faced his neighbors, friends, and critics. It was time to either burn his bridges or begin building new ones. Richard gripped the edges of the podium, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. The microphone amplified his shaky breath as he gathered his thoughts. My name is Richard Thompson, he began. 3 days ago, I punched a teenager for no good reason. There's no excuse for what I did. A heavy silence filled the room. No one had expected such a blunt admission. I've been a police officer in Pine Ridge for 15 years, Richard continued. I've always thought of myself as one of the good ones. I told myself I treated everyone the same. His voice cracked slightly. But that video doesn't lie. And neither can I, not anymore. He looked directly at Michael, who stood with his friends along the wall. When Michael and his father came to the park, I didn't see the new deputy chief and his son. I saw a threat. And that's the problem. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Richard pressed on. Michael has offered me a chance I don't deserve. A chance to be part of something important instead of just another cop who messed up and got fired. Richard paused. But this isn't my decision to make alone. It's yours too. He gestured to the community members filling the seats. If you want me gone, I'll turn in my resignation tonight. But if you're willing to let me try, to work with Michael and Deputy Chief Walker to make real changes, I promise I won't let you down. An older black woman in the front row stood up. Mrs. Johnson had owned the local bakery for decades. Richard had greeted her almost every morning for 15 years. Officer Thompson, she said, her voice firm. How do we know this isn't just talk to save your job? Richard nodded, acknowledging the fair question. You don't, Mrs. Johnson. All I can offer is my word and my actions going forward. Another voice called out from the back. What exactly would this program even look like? Before Richard could respond, Michael stepped forward. May I? He asked, gesturing to the microphone. Richard stepped aside, letting Michael take his place. We don't have all the details worked out, Michael admitted. But we're thinking about community forums where people can share their experiences with police, good and bad. Training sessions where officers learn about the history and perspectives of different groups in Pine Ridge. He looked at Richard. And accountability measures to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Deputy Chief Walker approached the microphone, standing beside his son. This would be a pilot program, he explained. With regular public updates on our progress. If it fails, the community can call for its end at any time. A young woman raised her hand. And you're really okay with this, Michael? Working with the man who hit you? Michael looked at Richard for a long moment before answering. I'm not doing this for Officer Thompson, he said finally. I'm doing it for Pine Ridge. For the kids who look like me who deserve to feel safe in their own town. The room grew quiet as everyone absorbed his words. Then, from the middle of the crowd, someone began to clap. Slowly, others joined in, not everyone, but enough. Richard felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. 2 weeks after the town meeting, Richard sat in the newly designated Community Relations Room at the Pine Ridge Police Department. What had once been a rarely used conference room now featured a circle of chairs and walls covered with community photos and resource information. Across from him, Michael flipped through a notebook filled with ideas. Deputy Chief Walker stood by the whiteboard, writing out an agenda for their first official forum scheduled for that evening. We've got 37 confirmed attendees, Walker said. Better turnout than I expected. People are curious, Michael replied. They want to see if we're serious. Richard nodded. And they have every right to be skeptical. During the past 2 weeks, Richard had been on restricted duty, no patrol, no public contact. Instead, he'd spent his days researching community policing models and meeting with Walker and Michael to develop their program. Chief Roberts had reluctantly approved a 3-month pilot, making it clear that one wrong move would end Richard's career. How's the jaw? Richard asked Michael quietly. The bruise had faded to a yellowish shadow, barely visible now. Michael touched it absently. Almost gone. Mom says it won't leave a scar. The physical mark might disappear, but Richard knew some wounds weren't so easily healed. Listen, Michael. I need to ask you something. Michael looked up from his notebook. What's up? Are you really okay with this? Working with me every week, sitting across from me like this? Because if you're not. I told you at the town meeting, Michael interrupted. I'm not doing this for you. I know. But that doesn't answer my question. Michael considered this, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. The first few days after it happened, I was angry. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how things could have gone worse if my dad hadn't been there. Walker paused his writing, listening silently. But then I realized something, Michael continued. Being angry doesn't fix anything. And Pine Ridge needs fixing. He met Richard's gaze directly. So no, I'm not completely okay with it yet. But I'm choosing to work with you anyway. Richard swallowed hard. Thank you for your honesty. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Jenny Chen poked her head in. Sorry to bother you, but there's someone who wants to see you all. She stepped aside, revealing Mrs. Johnson from the bakery. She carried a large box tied with string. Mrs. Johnson, Walker greeted her. This is a surprise. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, entering the room. I wanted to bring something for your first meeting tonight. She set the box on the table and untied the string, revealing rows of carefully arranged cookies. My contribution to the cause. Richard recognized the gesture for what it was, not just cookies, but a small step toward trust. You'll be there tonight? He asked. Mrs. Johnson nodded. Wouldn't miss it. I've got 67 years of living in this town, and plenty to say about the policing of it. Her eyes twinkled. Hope you're ready to listen, Officer Thompson. For the first time in weeks, Richard smiled genuinely. Yes, ma'am. That's why we're here. The community center hummed with nervous energy as people filed in for the first forum. Richard stood by the doorway, greeting residents as they entered. Some nodded politely, others avoided his gaze entirely. Michael and his father had arranged the chairs in a large circle, with no podium or table to create barriers. Name tags were optional, and several people chose to go without them. Deep breath, Deputy Chief Walker said, passing Richard a stack of handouts. This is going to be uncomfortable. That's the point. At 7 o'clock sharp, Walker called the meeting to order. Nearly 50 people had shown up, far more than the 37 who'd RSVP'd. Richard scanned the crowd, recognizing faces from all parts of Pine Ridge. Thank you for coming, Walker began. Before we start, I want to clarify what this is and isn't. This isn't a PR stunt or a quick fix. It's the beginning of a conversation that's long overdue in Pine Ridge. Michael stepped forward. We've prepared some discussion topics, but first, we thought Officer Thompson should say a few words. All eyes turned to Richard. He'd rehearsed what to say, but now the carefully prepared words felt hollow. Instead, he spoke from the heart. I've spent 2 weeks researching police reform initiatives, he said. I could quote statistics or studies. But that's not what tonight is about. He paused. Tonight is about listening. For 15 years, I thought I knew this community. I was wrong. So I'm here to learn about your experiences, your fears, your hopes for Pine Ridge. A heavy silence followed. Then, a middle-aged black man in the back raised his hand. My son is 14, he said. Every time he leaves the house, I worry. I give him the talk about how to act if police stop him. When I saw that video of you hitting Michael, all I could think was, that could have been my boy. Richard nodded, accepting the pain in the man's words. Thank you for sharing that. More hands went up. A woman described being followed by patrol cars for no reason. A teenager talked about officers questioning him for sitting in the park after school. An elderly man recounted police dismissing his reports of vandalism. Richard listened to each story, fighting the urge to defend or explain. This wasn't about him or his feelings. It was about finally hearing voices that had been silenced for too long. As the evening progressed, something shifted in the room. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile threads of understanding. 3 months later, Richard stood at the back of the community center, watching as Michael facilitated the weekly forum. What had begun as tense confrontations had gradually evolved into productive discussions. Tonight, they were reviewing the draft of new police protocols that the working group, a mix of officers and residents, had developed together. These ride-along programs have been implemented in other cities with positive results, Michael explained, pointing to the projected slide. At 16, he'd become an unexpected bridge between the police department and Pine Ridge's youth. Richard marveled at the transformation. Not just in the room, but in himself. He no longer wore a uniform to these meetings, a decision he'd made after participants said it created an invisible barrier. Today, he was dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt, his badge tucked away in his pocket. After the presentation concluded, Deputy Chief Walker approached Richard. The mayor called today. She wants to make the program permanent. That's great news, Richard said. The community surveys show significant improvement in trust levels. Walker nodded. Numbers are important. But what matters more is that people actually feel safer. Including my son. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Johnson, who had become one of the program's most vocal supporters. Just heard from the community college, she announced. They've agreed to offer scholarships for our youth police academy this summer. News like this would have been unimaginable 3 months ago. What had begun as a crisis was slowly becoming a model for other departments across the state. As people began filing out, Michael joined them. Dad, we should get going. Mom's waiting. Walker checked his watch. You're right. Ready, Officer Thompson? Richard nodded. What had started as formal planning meetings had evolved into Friday dinners at the Walker home, another bridge being carefully rebuilt. Outside, the evening sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge. As they walked to their cars, Richard spotted a group of teenagers playing basketball at the park where everything had changed. They waved at Michael, who waved back. One moment of lost control had nearly destroyed Richard's career and deepened the town's divisions. But because of Michael's courage and wisdom beyond his years, that same moment had become the catalyst for real change. Pine Ridge still had problems to solve and trust to rebuild. The work was far from over. But as Richard watched Michael laughing with his father, he knew that the path forward, though difficult, was finally clear. Sometimes, healing begins in the most unexpected ways. Even with a punch that became a promise.